Should be good now. All right. Was it? Okay, yeah, it was just this other one. All right, it's all good. It's all good. All right, chapter 4. This is the recap of chapter 4. Ursula plans a dance based on litcharts.com. Ursula plans a dance to inaugurate the newly renovated house, ordering a pianola to provide the music. An Italian expert named Pietro Crispi arrives to set up the instrument and to teach the dances that match the most current music. The family is awed by the music of the player piano. Jose Arcadio Buendia tries to take a picture of the ghost playing. Rebecca and Amaranta are enthralled by the handsome, genteel man. Jose Arcadio Buendia, having determined that God does not exist because he could not take his picture, takes the pianola apart 2 days before the party to try to figure out how it works. Though he tries to put it back together, the instrument doesn't work when Ursula attempts to get it to play at the party. Finally, Jose Arcadio Buendia forces the machine to play, but the notes are out of order. The partygoers dance anyway. Pietro Crispi returns to repair the pianola, and Amarant and Rebecca assist him. On the last day of his visit, they hold an impromptu dance, and Rebecca weeps when he leaves and goes back to eating dirt. One of the Mascote daughters, Amparo, begins to visit and secretly delivers a letter to Rebecca from Pietro Crispi. Aureliano Buendia's hopes of being joined with Remedios Mascote are revived, believing that she will accompany her sister on one of her visits. He walks through the town with his best friends, also second-generation Macondo residents. Magnifico Visbal and Hernaldo Marquez, looking for her but never sees her. One day while making little goldfish in the workshop, Aureliano Buendia hears Remedios' voice outside and invites her in. He gives her a fish and she runs away. Aureliano, pining for Remedios Mascote, begins writing poetry. Rebecca waits for more communication from Pietro Crispi. When the mail delivery mule doesn't arrive as expected, Rebecca has a tantrum, and Ursula forces open Rebecca's trunk, finding the letters. Aureliano Buendia goes with his friends to Caterino's store, where rooms have been added to serve as a brothel. Aureliano is repulsed by all the women, but soon blacks out and wakes up in the company of Pilar Ternera. They have sex, but Pilar Ternera offers to talk to Remedios Mascote for him. Amaranta, too, becomes lovesick over Pietro Crispi, though her love is unreturned. Remedios Mascote accepts the idea of marrying Aureliano. Jose Arcadio Buendia agrees to Rebecca marrying Pietro Crispi, but Amaranta swears to herself she will stop the wedding at all costs. Jose Arcadio Buendia goes to ask for the hand of Remedios Mascote. Mascotes believes he must be confused about which daughter his son wants to marry, and when Jose Arcadio Buendia sees little Remedios, he goes home to confirm. When he returns to say that, yes, Aureliano Buendia would like to marry little Remedios, her parents counter that there are 6 older daughters more suited for marriage, and that Remedios still wets the bed. Senor Mascote tells Ursula that Remedios has not yet reached puberty and the marriage is delayed. Melquiades dies again after suffering from a rapid process of aging that left him in a state of dementia. He drowns in the river, but Jose Arcadio Buendia is reluctant to bury him, believing him to be immortal. This is his second time dying, so perhaps not unreasonable for him to think that. Immortal in like the sense of the phoenix, like he keeps coming back from the dead. Or like, what's his name? Lazarus. Okay. Eventually they bury him and have a wake in his honor. Amaranta confesses her love to Pietro Crispi, but he doesn't return her interest. She promises to stop their wedding, and she is sent away on a trip to try to distract her with Ursula's company. Pietro Crispi visits often, bringing along gifts of mechanical toys that distract Jose Arcadio Buendia from his grief. Aureliano Buendia dedicates himself to teaching Remedios Moscote to read and write. Rebecca lives in fear of her sister's threats to stop the wedding. She goes to Pilar Ternera to read her future. Pilar tells her that she will not be happy as long as her parents remain unburied. She's confused, but Jose Arcadio Buendia goes in search of the bag of her parents' bones. He summons the masons who did the remodeling, and one reveals he encased the bones in a wall. They dig them out and bury them next to Melchiades. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Pilar Ternera begins to visit the house again and tells Aureliano that he will be good in war. Not that good, though, as we learn in the opening chapter of the book. Jose Arcadio Buendia connects a mechanical ballerina toy to a clock mechanism and is deliriously happy when the toy dances for 3 days straight. He loses sleep and sees again the ghost of the Prudencio Aguilar, the man he killed. Jose Arcadio Buendia begins to think that every day is the same as the one before. He falls into deep grief over those who have died and smashes everything in the laboratories, speaking gibberish. Aureliano Buendia calls the neighbors to help him, and 20 men are needed to overpower Jose Arcadio Buendia and tie him to a tree in the courtyard. Ursula and Amaranta return, and Jose Arcadio Buendia is still tied to the tree, totally unaware of who they are. They untie his wrists and ankles, but leave him tied at the waist, and build a shelter of palm branches to keep the sun and rain off him. Okay, that was Jose Arcadio Buendia who was going nuts last time. Okay. We find ourselves in chapter 5. Aureliano Buendia and Remedios Moscote were married one Sunday in March. Before the altar, Father Nicanor Reina had set up in the parlor. It was the culmination of 4 weeks of shocks in the Moscote household because little Remedios had reached puberty before getting over the habits of childhood. In spite of the fact that her mother had taught her about the changes of adolescence, one February afternoon, she burst shouting into the living room, where her sisters were chatting with Aureliano, showed them her panties, smeared with the chocolate-colored paste. A month for the wedding was agreed upon. There was barely enough time to teach her how to wash herself, get dressed by herself, and understand the fundamental business of a home. They made her urinate over hot bricks in order to cure her habit of wetting the bed. It took a good deal of work to convince her of the inviolability of the marital secret. For Remedios was so confused and at the same time so amazed at the revelation that she wanted to talk to everybody about the details of the wedding night. It was a fatiguing effort, but on the date set for the ceremony, the child was as adept in the ways of the world as any of her sisters. Don Apollonor Moscote escorted her by the arm down the street that was decorated with flowers and wreaths amidst the explosion of rockets and the music of several bands. She waved with her hand and gave her thanks with a smile to those who wished her good luck from the windows. Aureliano, dressed in black, wearing the same patent leather boots with metal fasteners that he would have on a few years later as he faced the firing squad, had an intense paleness and a hard lump in his throat when he met the bride at the door of the house and led her to the altar. She behaved so naturally, with such discretion, that she did not lose her composure, not even when Aureliano dropped the ring as he tried to put it on her finger. In the midst of the murmurs and confusion of the guests, she kept her arm with her fingerless lace glove held up and remained like that with her ring finger ready until the bridegroom managed to stop the ring with his foot before it rolled to the door, came back blushing to the altar. Her mother and sisters suffered so much from fear that the child would do something wrong during the ceremony that in the end they were the ones who committed the impertinence of picking her up to kiss her. From that day on, the sense of responsibility, the natural grace, the calm control that Remedios would have in the face of adverse circumstances was revealed. It was she who, in her own initiative, put aside the largest piece that she had cut from the wedding cake and took it on a plate with a fork to Jose Arcadio Buendia. Tied to the trunk of the chestnut tree, huddled on a wooden stool underneath the palm shelter, the enormous old man, discolored by the sun and rain, made a vague smile of gratitude and ate the piece of cake with his fingers, mumbling an unintelligible psalm. The only unhappy person in that noisy celebration, which lasted until dawn on Monday, was Rebecca Buendia. It was her own frustrated party. By an arrangement of Ursula's, her marriage was to be celebrated on the same day, but that Friday, Pietro Crispi received a letter with the news of his mother's imminent death. The wedding was postponed. Pietro Crispi left for the capital of the province an hour after receiving the letter. On the road, he missed his mother, who arrived punctually Saturday night and at Aureliano's wedding sang sad aria that she had prepared for the wedding of her son. Pietro Crispi returned on Sunday night to sweep up the ashes of the party after having worn out 5 horses on the road in an attempt to be in time for his wedding. I was a little bit confused. I thought this was Aureliano's wedding. I guess there are 2 weddings, based on what I'm understanding. Pietro's and Aureliano's. Unless it's still referring to Aureliano's wedding, which it might be. It was never discovered who wrote the letter. Tormented by Ursula, Amaranta wept with indignation and swore her innocence in front of the altar, which the carpenters had not finished dismantling. Father Nicanor Reyna, whom Don Apollonar Mascote had brought from the swamp to officiate the wedding, was an old man hardened by the ingratitude of his ministry. His skin was sad, the bones almost exposed, and he had a pronounced round stomach and the expression of an old angel, which came more from simplicity than from goodness. He planned to return to his parish after the wedding, but he was appalled at the hardiness of the inhabitants of Macondo, who were prospering in the midst of scandal, subject to the natural law, without baptizing their children or sanctifying their festivals. Thinking that no land needed the seed of God so much, he decided to stay on for another week to Christianize both circumcised and Gentile, legalize concubinage, and give the sacraments to the dying. Okay. And no one paid any attention to him. They would answer him that they had been many years without a priest, arranging the business of their souls directly with God, and that they had lost the evil of original sin. Tired of preaching in the open, Father Nicanor decided to undertake the building of a church, the largest in the world, with life-size saints and stained glass windows on the sides, so that people would come from Rome to honor God in the center of impiety. As you might recall, 2 chapters ago, if I'm not mistaken, the influence of government was first exposed to Macondo, and now it's the influence of religion, and now here in chapter 5. You could say that this is the influence not of religion but of the church, because it is the case that Jose Arcadio Buendia already had a perhaps just faint belief in God earlier in the novel, and this is a priest now. I think it's an interesting distinction to make between religion and church. Yeah, it could be that this is just the influence of the church and not specifically religion, but we'll see. Yeah, it sounds like, based on what is being written in the paragraph here, that it's the people of Macondo were already religious. But yeah, this is the institution of the church that is represented by Father Nicanor. Tired of preaching in the open, Father Nicanor decided to undertake the building of a church, the largest in the world, with life-size saints and stained glass windows on the side, so that people would come from Rome to honor God in the center of impiety. He went everywhere begging alms with a copper dish. They gave him a large amount, but he wanted more, because the church had to have a bell that would raise the drown up to the surface of the water. Wow. He pleaded so much that he lost his voice. His bones began to fill with sounds. One Saturday, not even having collected the price of the doors, he fell into a desperate confusion. He improvised an altar in the square, and on Sunday he went through the town with a small bell, as in the days of insomnia, calling people to an open-air mass. Many went out of curiosity, others from nostalgia, others so that God would not take the disdain for his intermediary as a personal insult. So that at 8 a.m, half the town was in the square, where Father Nicanor chanted the Gospels in a voice that had been lacerated by his pleading. At the end, when the congregation began to break up, he raised his arms, signaling for attention. "Just a moment," he said. "Now we shall witness an undeniable proof of the infinite power of God." The boy who'd helped him with the mass brought him a cup of thick and steaming chocolate, which he drank without pausing to breathe. Then he wiped his lips with a handkerchief that he drew from his sleeve, extended his arms, and closed his eyes. Thereupon Father Nicanor rose 6 inches above the level of the ground. It was a convincing measure. He went among the houses for several days, repeating the demonstration of levitation by means of chocolate, while the acolyte collected so much money in a bag that in less than a month he began the construction of the church. No one doubted the divine origin of the demonstration except Jose Arcadio Buendia, who without changing expression watched the troop of people who gathered around the chestnut tree one morning to witness the revelation once more. He merely stretched on his stool a little and shrugged his shoulders when Father Nicanor began to raise up from the ground, along with the chair he was sitting on. Perhaps because of his disbelief in God from the daguerreotype, or it could also perhaps be Jose Arcadio Buendia's predisposition to magical effects and influences. Hoc est simplicissimus, Jose Arcadio Buendia said. Homo est statum quartum materiae invenit. I'm not sure how to understand what this says, but that's what it says. Father Nicanor raised his hands, and the four legs of the chair all landed on the ground at the same time. Nego, he said, factum hoc existentiatum deprobat sine dubio. Thus it was discovered that Jose Arcadio Buendia's devilish jargon was Latin. Father Nicanor took advantage of the circumstance of his being the only person who had been able to communicate with him to try to inject the faith into his twisted mind. Every afternoon he would sit by the chestnut tree preaching in Latin. Jose Arcadio Buendia insisted on rejecting rhetorical tricks and the transmutation of chocolate, and he demanded the daguerreotype of God as the only proof. Father Nicanor then brought him medals and pictures and even a reproduction of the Veronica, but Jose Arcadio Buendia rejected them as artistic objects without any scientific basis. He was so stubborn that Father Nicanor gave up his attempts at evangelization and continued visiting him out of humanitarian feelings. But then it was Jose Arcadio Buendia who took the lead and tried to break down the priest's faith with rationalist tricks. On a certain occasion, when Father Nicanor brought a checker set to the chestnut tree and invited him to a game, Jose Arcadio Buendia would not accept, because according to him, he could not understand the sense of a contest in which two adversaries have agreed upon the rules. Father Nicanor, who had never seen checkers played that way, could not play it again. Even more startled at Jose Arcadio Buendia's lucidity, he asked him how it was possible they had tied him to a tree. Hoc est simplissimus, he replied. Because I'm crazy. From then on, concerned about his own faith, the priest did not come back to visit him and dedicated himself to hurrying along the building of the church. Rebecca felt her hopes of being reborn. Her future was predicated on the completion of the work. For one Sunday, when Father Nicanor was lunching at the house and the whole family sitting at the table spoke of the solemnity and splendor that religious ceremonies would acquire when the church was built, Amaranta said the luckiest one will be Rebecca. Since Rebecca did not understand what she meant, she explained it to her with an innocent smile. You're going to be the one who will inaugurate the church with your wedding. Rebecca tried to forestall any comments. The way the construction was going, the church would not be built before another 10 years. Father Nicanor did not agree. The growing generosity of the faithful permitted him to make more optimistic calculations. Yeah, and that's assuming, of course, that Amaranta doesn't try to break up the wedding, which she might. To the mute indignation of Rebecca, who could not finish her lunch, Ursula celebrated Amaranta's idea and contributed a considerable sum for the work to move faster. Father Nicanor felt that with another contribution like that, the church would be ready within 3 years. From then on, Rebecca did not say a word to Amaranta, convinced that her initiative had not the innocence that she attempted to give it. That was the least serious thing I could have done, Amaranta answered her during the violent argument that they had that night. In that way, I won't have to kill you for 3 years. Rebecca accepted the challenge. Exactly. Amaranta's going to try to stop it when it happens. We'll see if she does follow through on that. When Pietro Crispi found out about the new postponement, he went through a crisis of disappointment. But Rebecca gave him a final proof of her loyalty. We'll elope whenever you say, she told him. Pietro Crispi, however, was not a man of adventure. He lacked the impulsive character of his fiancée, and he considered respect for one's given word as wealth that should not be squandered. Then Rebecca turned to more audacious methods. A mysterious wind blew out the lamps in the parlor, and Ursula surprised the lovers kissing in the dark. Pitcher Crispy gave her some confused explanations about the poor quality of modern pitch lamps, and even helped her install a more secure system of illumination in the room. But the fuel failed again, or the wicks became clogged, and Ursula found Rebecca sitting on her fiancé's lap. This time she would accept no explanation. She turned the responsibility of the bakery over to the Indian woman, sat in a rocking chair to watch over the young people during the visits, ready to win out over maneuvers that had already been old when she was a girl. Poor Mama, Rebecca would say with mock indignation, seeing Ursula yawn during the boredom of the visits. When she dies, she'll go off to her reward in that rocking chair. After 3 months of supervised love, fatigued by the slow progress of the construction, which he went on to expect every day, Pietro Crispi decided to give Father Nicanor the money he needed to finish the church. Amaranta did not grow impatient. She conversed with her girlfriends every afternoon. When they came to embroider on the porch, she tried to think of new subterfuges. A mistake in calculation spoiled the one that she considered most effective, removing the mothballs that Rebecca had put in her wedding dress before she put it away in the bedroom dresser. She did it when 2 months were left for the completion of the church. But Rebecca was so impatient with the approach of the wedding that she wanted to get the dress ready earlier than Amaranta had foreseen. When she opened the dresser and unfolded the first papers and then the protective cloth, she found the fabric of the dress and the stitches of the veil and even the crown of orange blossoms perforated by moths. Although she was sure that she had put a handful of mothballs in the wrappings, the disaster seemed so natural that she did not dare blame Amaranta. There was less than a month until the wedding, but Impero Moscote promised to sew a new dress within a week. Amaranta felt faint that rainy noontime when Impero came to the house, wrapped in the froth of needlework for Rebecca to have the final fitting of the dress. She lost her voice, and a thread of cold sweat ran down the path of her spine. For long months she had trembled with fright waiting for that hour, because if she had not been able to conceive the ultimate obstacle to Rebecca's wedding, she was sure that at that last moment, when all the resources of her imagination had failed, she would have the courage to poison her. That afternoon, while Rebecca was suffocating with heat inside the armor of thread that Impero Moscote was putting about her body with thousands of pins in infinite patience, Amaranta made several mistakes in her crocheting and pricked her finger with the needle, but she decided with frightful coldness that the date would be the last Friday before the wedding and the method would be a dose of laudanum in her coffee. A greater obstacle, as impassable as it was unforeseen, obliged a new and indefinite postponement. 1 week before the date set for the wedding, little Remedios woke up in the middle of the night, soaked in a hot broth, which had exploded in her insides with a kind of tearing belch. She died 3 days later, poisoned by her own blood, with a pair of twins crossed in her stomach. Amaranta suffered a crisis of conscience. She had begged God with such fervor for something fearful to happen so that she would not have to poison Rebecca, that she felt guilty of Remedios' death. Did she have something to do with it? I don't know. That was not the obstacle that she had begged for so much. Remedios had brought a breath of merriment to the house. She had settled down with her husband in a room near the workshop, which she decorated with the dolls and toys of her recent childhood. And her merry vitality overflowed the 4 walls of the bedroom and went, like a whirlwind of good health, along the porch with the begonias. She would start singing at dawn. She was the only person who dared intervene in the arguments between Rebecca and Amaranta. She plunged into the fatiguing chore of taking care of Jose Arcadio Buendia. She would bring him his food. She would help him with his daily necessities, wash him with soap and a scrubbing brush, keep his hair and beard free of lice and nits, keep the palm shelter in good condition, and reinforce it with waterproof canvas in stormy weather. Wow. I'm surprised not even Ursula is doing that. In her last months, she had succeeded in communicating with him in phrases of rudimentary Latin. The son of Aureliano Pilar Ternera was born, brought to the house, and baptized in an intimate ceremony with the name Aureliano Jose. Remedios decided that he would be considered their oldest child. Her maternal instinct surprised Ursula. Aureliano, for his part, found in her the justification that he needed to live. He worked all day in his workshop, and Remedios would bring him a cup of black coffee in the middle of the morning. They would both visit the Moscotes every night. Aureliano would play endless games of dominoes with his father-in-law, while Remedios chatted with her sisters or talked to her mother about more important things. The link between the Buendias consolidated Don Apollonio Moscote's authority in the town. Frequent trips to the capital of the province, he succeeded in getting the government to build a school so that Arcadio who had inherited the educational enthusiasm of his grandfather, could take charge of it. Through persuasion, he managed to get the majority of houses painted blue in time for the date of national events. At the urging of Father Nicanor, he arranged for the transfer of Caterina's store to a back street. He closed down several scandalous establishments that prospered in the center of town. Once he returned with 6 policemen armed with rifles, to whom he entrusted the maintenance of order. No one remembered the original agreement not to have armed men in the town. Aureliano enjoyed his father-in-law's efficiency. "You're going to get as fat as he is," his friends would say to him. But his sedentary life, which accentuated his cheekbones and concentrated the sparkle of his eyes, did not increase his weight or alter the parsimony of his character, but on the contrary, it hardened on his lips the straight line of solitary meditation and implacable decision. So deep was the affection that he and his wife had succeeded in arousing in both their families that when Remedios announced that she was going to have a child, even Rebecca and Amaranta declared a truce in order to knit items in blue wool if it was to be a boy and in pink wool in case it was a girl. She was the last person Arcadio thought about a few years later when he was facing the firing squad. Arcadio, their adopted son, Ursula ordered a morning period of closed doors and windows, with no one entering or leaving except on matters of utmost necessity. She prohibited any talking aloud for a year, and she put Remedios' daguerreotype in the place where her body had been laid out, the black ribbon round it, and an oil lamp that was always kept lighted. Future generations, who never let the lamp go out, would be puzzled at that girl in a pleated skirt, white boots, with an organdy brand around her head. They were never able to connect her with the standard image of a great-grandmother. Amaranta took charge of Aureliano Jose. She adopted him as a son who would share her solitude, and relieve her from the involuntary laudanum that her mad beseeching had thrown into Remedios' coffee. I guess she poisoned her, I guess. Maybe she felt bad about it. Pietro Crispi would tiptoe in at dusk, the black ribbon on his hat, and he would pay a silent visit to Rebecca, who seemed to be bleeding to death inside the black dress with sleeves down to her wrists. Just the idea of thinking about a new date for the wedding would have been so irreverent that the engagement turned into an eternal relationship, a fatigued love that no one worried about again, as if the lovers who in other days had sabotaged the lamps in order to kiss had been abandoned to the free will of death. Having lost her bearings, completely demoralized, Rebecca began eating earth again. Suddenly, when the morning had gone on so long, the needlepoint sessions began. Someone pushed open the street door at 2 in the afternoon that mortal sounds of the heat. And the braces and the foundation shook with such force that Amaranta and her friends sewing on the porch, Rebecca sucking her finger in her bedroom, Ursula in the kitchen, Aureliano in the workshop, and even Jose Arcadio Buendia under the solitary chestnut tree, had impression that an earthquake was breaking up the house. A huge man had arrived. His square shoulders barely fitted through the doorways. He was wearing a medal of Our Lady of Help around his bison neck. His arms and chest were completely covered with cryptic tattooing. On his right wrist was the tight copper bracelet of the Niños en Cruz amulet. His skin was tanned by the salts of the open air. His hair was short and straight like the mane of a mule. His jaws were of iron, and he wore a sad smile. He had a belt on that was twice as thick as the cinch of a horse, boots with leggings and spurs and iron on the heels. And his presence gave the quaking impression of a seismic tremor. He went through the parlor and the living room, carrying some half-worn saddlebags in his hand. He peered like a thunderclap on the porch with the begonias where Amaranta and her friends were paralyzed, their needles in the air. "Hello," he said to them in a tired voice, threw the saddlebags on the work table, and went by on his way to the back of the house. "Hello," he said to the startled Rebecca, who saw him pass by the door of her bedroom. "Hello," he said to Aureliano, who's at his silversmith's bench with all 5 senses alert. He did not linger with anyone. He went directly to the kitchen, and there he stopped for the first time at the end of a trip that had begun on the other side of the world. "Hello," he said. Ursula stood for a fraction of a second with her mouth open, looked into his eyes, gave a cry, and flung her arms around his neck, shouting and weeping with joy. It was Jose Arcadio. He was returning as poor as when he had left, to such an extreme that Ursula had to give him 2 pesos to pay for the rental of his horse. He spoke a Spanish that had larded with sailor slang. They asked where he had been, and he answered, "Out there." He hung his hammock in the room they assigned him and slept for 3 days. When he woke up after eating 16 raw eggs, he went directly to Caterina's store, where his monumental size provoked a panic of curiosity among the women. He called for music and cane liquor for everyone to be put on his bill. He would Indian wrestle with 5 men at the same time. "It can't be done," they said, convinced that they would not be able to move his arm. "He has niños en cruz." Caterina, who did not believe in magical tricks of strength, bet him 12 pesos that he could not move the counter. Jose Arcadio pulled it out of its place, slipped it over his head, put it in the street. It took 11 men to put it back. In the heat of the party, he exhibited his unusual masculinity on the bar, completely covered with tattoos of words in several languages intertwined in blue and red. To the women who were besieging him and coveting him, he put the question as to who would pay the most. The one who had the most money offered him 20 pesos. Then he proposed raffling himself off among them at 10 pesos a chance. It was a fantastic price because the most sought-after women earned 8 pesos a night, but they all accepted. They wrote their names on 14 pieces of paper, which they put into a hat, and each woman took one out. When there were only 2 pieces left to draw, it was established to whom they belonged. 5 pesos more from each one, Jose Arcadio proposed, and I'll share myself with both. Wow. That's all I gotta say, wow. He made his living that way. I would say extremely uncommon and extremely impressive as well. He'd been around the world 65 times, enlisted in a crew of sailors without a country. The woman who went to bed with him that night in Caterina's store brought him naked into the dance salon so that people could see that there was not a square inch of his body that was not tattooed, front and back, from his neck to his toes. He did not succeed in becoming incorporated into the family. He slept all day and spent the night in the red light district, making bets on his strength. On a rare occasion, when Ursula got him to sit down at the table, he gave signs of radiant good humor, especially when he told about his adventures in remote countries. He'd been shipwrecked and spent 2 weeks adrift in the Sea of Japan, feeding on the body of a comrade who had succumbed to sunstroke, and whose extremely salty flesh as it cooked in the sun had a sweet and granular taste. Under a bright noonday sun in the Gulf of Bengal, his ship had killed a sea dragon, in the stomach of which they found the helmet, the buckles, and the weapons of a crusader. In the Caribbean, he had seen the ghost of the pirate ship of Victor Hughes, with its sails torn by the winds of death, the masts chewed by sea worms, still looking for the course to Guadalupe. Ursula would weep at the table as if she were reading the letters that had never arrived, in which Jose Arcadio told about his deeds and misadventures. "There's so much of a home here for you, my son," she would sob. "So much food thrown to the hogs." But underneath it all, she could not conceive that the boy the gypsies took away was the same lout who would eat half a suckling pig for lunch, and whose flatulence withered the flowers. Much like Pumbaa. Something similar took place with the rest of the family. Amaranta could not conceal the repugnance that she felt at the table because of his bestial belching. Arcadio, who never knew the secret of their relationship, scarcely answered the questions that he asked with the obvious idea of gaining his affection. Aureliano tried to relive the times when they slept in the same room, tried to revive the complicity of childhood, but Jose Arcadio had forgotten about it because life at sea had saturated his memory with too many things to remember. Only Rebecca succumbed to the first impact. The day that she saw him pass by her bedroom, she thought that Pietro Crispi was a sugary dandy next to that proto-male, whose volcanic breathing could be heard all over the house. She tried to get near him under any pretext. On a certain occasion, Jose Arcadio looked at her body with shameless attention and said to her, "You're a woman, little sister." Rebecca lost control of herself. She went back to eating earth and whitewashing the walls in the avidity of previous days. She sucked her finger with so much anxiety that she developed a callus on her thumb. She vomited up a green liquid with dead leeches in it. Okay. She spent nights awake, shaking with fever, fighting against delirium, waiting until the house shook with the return of Jose Arcadio at dawn. One afternoon, when everyone was having a siesta, she could no longer resist and went to his bedroom. She found him in his shorts, lying in the hammock that he had hung from the beams with the ship's hawser. She was so impressed by his enormous, motley nakedness that she felt an impulse to retreat. "Excuse me," she said. "I didn't know you were here." But she lowered her voice so as to not wake anyone up. "Come here," he said. Rebecca obeyed. She stopped beside the hammock in an icy sweat, feeling knots forming in her intestines, while Jose Arcadio stroked her ankles with the tips of his fingers, then her calves, then her thighs, murmuring, "Oh, little sister, little sister." She had to make a supernatural effort not to die when a startlingly regulated cyclonic power lifted her up by the waist and despoiled her of her intimacy with 3 slashes of its claws and quartered her like a little bird. Again, wow. She managed to thank God for having been born before she lost herself in the inconceivable pleasure of that unbearable pain. Splashing in the streaming marsh of the hammock, which absorbed the explosion of blood like a blotter. 3 days later, they were married during the 5 o'clock mass. Wow, really? Rebecca marries Jose Arcadio instead of Pietro Crispi? Jose Arcadio had gone to Pietro Crispi's store the day before, found him giving a zither lesson, and did not draw him aside to speak to him. Well, uh, at least, Rebecca doesn't have to worry about Amarante killing her now. That's a plus. "I'm going to marry Rebecca," he told him. Pietro Crispi turned pale, gave the zither to one of his pupils, and dismissed the class. When they were alone in the room that was crowded with musical instruments and mechanical toys, Pietro Crispi said, "She's your sister." "I don't care," Jose Arcadio replied. Some incestual relations we got going. Pietro Crispi mopped his brow with a handkerchief that was soaked in lavender. "It's against nature," he explained, "and besides, it's against the law." Jose Arcadio grew impatient, not so much at the argument as over Pietro Crispi's paleness. "Fuck nature 2 times over," he said. "I've come to tell you not to bother going to ask Rebecca anything." But his brutal deportment broke down when he saw Pietro Crispi's eyes grow moist. "Now," he said to him in a different tone, "if you really like the family, there's Amaranta for you." Gosh. What is Jose Arcadio supposed to represent? I don't know. I really don't know. It's I would say uh, animal foolishness of animals. I would say how to be a caveman. Maybe. Hold on. There. Father Nicanor revealed in his Sunday sermon that Jose Arcadio and Rebecca were not brother and sister. Okay. Ursula never forgave what she considered an inconceivable lack of respect. When they came back from church, she forbade the newlyweds to set foot in the house again. For her, it was as if they were dead. So they rented a house across from the cemetery and established themselves there with no other furniture but Jose Arcadio's hammock. On their wedding night, a scorpion that had got into her slipper bit Rebecca on the foot. It bit her, it didn't sting her, really. Her tongue went to sleep, but that did not stop them from spending a scandalous honeymoon. The neighbors were startled by the cries that woke up the whole district, as many as 8 times in a single night and 3 times during siesta. They prayed that such wild passion would not disturb the peace of the dead. Again, wow. Liliana was the only one who was concerned about them. He brought them some furniture and gave them some money until Jose Arcadio recovered his sense of reality and worked the no man's land that bordered the courtyard of the house. So they're the only ones living there now? So I guess Amaranta, on the other hand, never did overcome her rancor against Rebecca, even though life offered her a satisfaction of which she had not dreamed. At the initiative of Ursula, who did not know how to repair the shame, Pietro Crispi continued having lunch at the house on Tuesdays, rising above his defeat with a serene dignity. He still wore the black ribbon on his hat as a sign of respect for the family, and he took pleasure in showing his affection for Ursula by bringing her exotic gifts: Portuguese sardines, Turkish rose marmalade, and on one occasion a lovely manila shawl. Amaranta looked after him with a loving diligence. She anticipated his wants, pulled out the threads on the cuffs of his shirt, embroidered a dozen handkerchiefs with his initials for his birthday. Tuesdays after lunch, when she would embroider on the porch, he would keep her happy company. For Pietro Crispi, that woman whom he always had considered and treated as a child was a revelation. Although her temperament lacked grace, she had a rare sensibility for appreciating the things of the world and had a secret tenderness. One Tuesday, when no one doubted that sooner or later it had to happen, Pietro Crispi asked her to marry him. She did not stop her work. She waited for the hot blush to leave her ears and gave her voice a serene stress of maturity. "Of course, Crespi," she said, but when we know each other better, it's never good to be hasty in things." Ursula was confused. In spite of the esteem she had for Pietro Crispi, she could not tell whether his decision was good or bad from a moral point of view after his prolonged and famous engagement to Rebecca. Probably bad. Yeah, probably not morally sound. That's love for you. Sometimes it's messy. She finally accepted it as an unqualified fact because no one shared her doubts. Aureliano, who was the man of the house, confused her further with his enigmatic and final opinion. "These are not times to go around thinking about weddings." That opinion, which Ursula understood only some months later, was the only sincere one that Aureliano could express at that moment, not only with respect to marriage, but to anything that was not war. He himself, facing a firing squad, would not understand too well the concatenation. I have to look it up. First time I've seen that word used. Interconnected things or events. The series of subtle but irrevocable accidents that brought him to that point. The death of Remedios had not produced the despair that he had feared. It was rather a dull feeling of rage that gradually dissolved in a solitary, impassive frustration, similar to the one he had felt during the time he was resigned to living without a woman. He plunged into his work again, but he kept up the custom of playing dominoes with his father-in-law. In the house bound up in mourning, nightly conversations consolidated the friendship between the two men. "Get married again, Aurelito," his father-in-law would tell him. "I have 6 daughters for you to choose from." My kind of father-in-law, holy smokes. On one occasion on the eve of the elections, Don Apollonar, Viscote, returned from one of his frequent trips, worried about the political situation in the country. The liberals were determined to go to war. Since Aureliano at that time had very confused notions about the difference between conservatives and liberals, his father-in-law gave him some schematic lessons. The liberals, he said, were Freemasons, bad people, wanting to hang priests, to institute civil marriage and divorce, to recognize the rights of illegitimate children as equal to those of legitimate ones, and to cut the country up into a federal system that would take power away from the supreme authority. The conservatives, on the other hand, who had received their power directly from God, proposed the establishment of public order and family morality. They were the defenders of the faith of Christ and of the principle of authority, were not prepared to permit the country to be broken down into autonomous entities. Because of this humanitarian feeling, Aureliano sympathized with the liberal attitude with respect to the right of natural children. But in any case, he cannot understand how people arrived at the extreme of waging war over things that cannot be touched with the hand. It seemed an exaggeration to him that for the elections his father-in-law had them send 6 soldiers armed with rifles under the command of a sergeant to a town with no political passions. They not only arrived, but they went from house to house, confiscating hunting weapons, machetes, and even kitchen knives before they distributed among males over 21 the blue ballots with the names of the conservative candidates and the red ballots with the names of the liberal candidates. On the eve of the elections, Don Apollonar Viscote himself read a decree that prohibited the sale of alcoholic beverages, the gathering of more than 3 people who were not of the same family. The elections took place without incident. At 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, a wooden ballot box was set up in the square, which was watched over by 6 soldiers. The voting was absolutely free, as Aureliano himself was able to attest, since he spent almost the entire day with his father-in-law, seeing that no one voted more than once. Or in the afternoon, a roll of drums in the square announced the closing of the polls, and Don Apollonio Moscote sealed the ballot box with a label crossed by his signature. That night, while he played dominoes with Aureliano, he ordered the sergeant to break the seal in order to count the votes. There were almost as many red ballots as blue. The sergeant left only 10 red ones and made the difference with blue ones. Then they sealed the box again with a new label, and the first thing on the following day it was taken to the capital of the province. The liberals will go to war, Aureliano said. Don Apollonio concentrated on his domino pieces. If you're saying that because of the switch in ballots, they won't, he said. We left a few red ones in there so there won't be any complaints. Aureliano understood the disadvantages of being in the opposition. If I were a liberal, he said, I'd go to war because of those ballots. His father-in-law looked at him over his glasses. Yeah, that's voting for you. Expect there to be shenanigans. Whether that's stuffing ballot boxes or just straight up election interference. Like it's as old as voting. Come now, Arlito, he said. If you were a liberal, even though you're my son-in-law, you wouldn't have seen the switching of the ballots. What really caused indignation in the town was not the results of the elections, but the fact that the soldiers had now returned the weapons. A group of women spoke with Aureliano so that he could obtain a return of their kitchen knives from his father-in-law. Don Apollonio Moscote explained to him, in strictest confidence, that the soldiers had taken the weapons off as proof that the liberals were preparing for war. The cynicism of the remark alarmed him. He said nothing, but on a certain night when Herrinaldo Marquez and Magnifico Vesbal were speaking with some of their friends about the incident of the knives, they asked him if he was a liberal or a conservative. Aureliano did not hesitate. If I have to be something, I'll be a liberal, he said, because the conservatives are tricky. And the following day, at the urging of his friends, he went to see Dr. Illyrio Nogueira to be treated for a supposed pain in his liver. He did not even understand the meaning of the subterfuge. Dr. Illyrio Nogueira had arrived in Macondo a few years before with a medicine chest of tasteless pills and a medical motto that convinced no one. One nail draws another. In reality, he was a charlatan. Behind his innocent facade of a doctor without prestige, there was a hidden terrorist who, with his short-legged boots, covered the scars that 5 years in the stocks had left on his legs. Taken prisoner during the first Federalist adventure, he managed to escape to Curacao, disguised in the garment he detested most in this world, a cassock. The end of a prolonged exile, stirred up by the exciting news that exiles from all over the Caribbean brought to Curacao. He set out in a smuggler's schooner and appeared in Rio Hacha with the bottles of pills that were nothing but refined sugar and a diploma from the University of Leipzig that he forged himself. He wept with disappointment. The Federalist fervor, which the exiles had pictured as a powder keg about to explode, had dissolved into a vague electoral illusion. Embittered by failure, yearning for a safe place where he could wait old age, the false homeopath took refuge in Macondo. In the narrow, bottle-crowded room that he rented on one side of the square, he lived several years off the hopelessly ill who, after having tried everything, consoled themselves with sugar pills. His instincts of an agitator remained dormant as long as Don Apollonio Moscote was a figurehead. He passed the time remembering and fighting against asthma. The approach of the elections was the thread that led him once more to the skying of subversion. He made contact with the young people in the town who lacked political knowledge, and he embarked on a stealthy campaign of instigation. The numerous red ballots that appeared in the box were attributed to Don Apollonio Moscote to the curiosity that came from youth were part of his plan. He made his disciples vote in order to show them that elections were a farce. The only effective thing, he would say, is violence. The majority of Aureliano's friends were enthusiastic over the idea of liquidating the conservative establishment, but no one had dared include him in the plans, not only because of his ties with the magistrate, but because of his solitary and elusive character. It was known, furthermore, that he had voted blue at his father-in-law's direction. So it was a simple matter of chance that he revealed his political sentiments. It was purely a matter of curiosity, a caprice, that brought him to visit the doctor for the treatment of pain that he did not have. In the den that smelled of camphorated cobwebs, he found himself facing a kind of dusty iguana whose lungs whistled when he breathed. Before asking him any questions, the doctor took him to the window and examined the inside of the lower eyelid. "It's not there," Aureliano said, following what they told him. He pushed the tips of his fingers into his liver and added, "Here's where I have the pain that won't let me sleep." Then Dr. Noguera closed the window with the pretext there was too much sun. Explained to him in simple terms that it was a patriotic duty to assassinate conservatives. For several days, Aureliano carried a small bottle of pills in his shirt pocket. He'd take it out every 2 hours, put 3 pills in the palm of his hand, popped them into his mouth for them to be slowly dissolved on his tongue. Don Apollinaire Moscote made fun of his faith in homeopathy. Those who were in on the plot recognized another one for their people in him. Almost all the sons of the founders were implicated, although none of them knew concretely what action they were plotting. Nevertheless, the day the doctor revealed the secret to Aureliano, the latter elicited the whole plan of the conspiracy. Although he was convinced at the time of the urgency of liquidating the conservative regime, the plot horrified him. Dr. Noguera had a mystique of a personal assassination. His system was reduced to coordinating a series of individual actions in which one masterstroke, covering the whole nation, would liquidate the functionaries of the regime along with their respective families, especially the children, in order to exterminate conservatism at its roots. Don Apollinaire Moscote, his wife, and his 6 daughters, needless to say, were on the list. "You're no liberal or anything else," Aureliano told him without getting excited. "You're nothing but a butcher." "In that case," the doctor replied with equal calm, "give me back the bottle. You don't need it anymore." Only 6 months later did Aureliano learn that the doctor had given up on him as a man of action because he was a sentimental person with no future, with a passive character, and a definite solitary vocation. They tried to keep him surrounded, fearing that he would betray the conspiracy. Aureliano calmed them down. He would not say a word, but on the night they went to murder the Moscote family, they would find him guarding the door. He showed such a convincing decision that the plan was postponed for an indefinite date. It was during those days that Ursula asked his opinion about the marriage between Pietro Crispi and Amaranta. He answered that these were not times to be thinking about such a thing. For a week he had been carrying an old-fashioned pistol under his shirt, kept his eyes on his friends. In the afternoon he would go have coffee with Jose Arcadio and Rebecca, who had begun to put their house in order. From 7 o'clock on, he would play dominoes with his father-in-law. At lunchtime he was chatting with Arcadio, who was already a huge adolescent, and he found him more and more excited over the imminence of war. The school where Arcadio had pupils older than himself mixed in with children who were barely being able to talk. The liberal fever had caught on. There was talk of shooting Father Nicanor, of turning the church into a school, of instituting free love. Aureliano tried to calm down his drive. He recommended discretion and prudence to him. Deaf to his calm reasoning, to his sense of reality, Arcadio reproached him in public for his weakness of character. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jose Arcadio is meant to be some sort of loose cannon or something. Like a revolutionary or a just generally dangerous person, I guess. Aureliano waited. Finally, in the beginning of December, Ursula burst into the workshop all upset. War's broken out. War, in fact, had broken out 3 months before. Martial law was in effect in the whole country. The only one who knew it immediately was Don Apollinaire Moscote, but he did not give the news, even to his wife, while the army platoon that was to occupy the town by surprise was on its way. They entered noiselessly before dawn, with 2 pieces of light artillery drawn by mules. They set up their headquarters in the school. 6 p.m. curfew was established. A more drastic search than the previous one was undertaken house by house, and this time they even took farm implements. They dragged out Dr. Noguera, tied him to a tree in the square, shot him without any due process of law. Father Nicanor tried to impress the military authorities with the miracle of levitation and had his head split open by the butt of a soldier's rifle. The liberal exultation had been extinguished into a silent terror. Aureliano, pale, mysterious, continued playing dominoes with his father-in-law, and understood that in spite of his present title of civil and military leader of the town, Don Apollinaire Moscote was more a figurehead. The decisions were made by the army captain, who each morning collected an extraordinary levy for the defense of public order. 4 soldiers under his command snatched a woman who had been bitten by a mad dog from her family and killed her with their rifle butts. these soldiers. On Sunday, 2 weeks after the occupation, Aureliano entered Hernando Marquez's house and, with his usual terseness, asked for a mug of coffee without sugar. When the two of them were alone in the kitchen, Aureliano gave his voice an authority that had never been heard before. "Get the boys ready," he said. "We're going to war." Hernando Marquez did not believe him. "With what weapons?" he asked. "With theirs," Aureliano replied. Tuesday at midnight, a mad operation, 21 men under the age of 30, commanded by Aureliano Buendia, armed with table knives and sharpened tools, took the garrison by surprise, seized the weapons, and in the courtyard executed the captain and the 4 soldiers who had killed the woman. That same night, with the sound of the firing squad could be heard, Arcadia was named civil and military leader of the town. The married rebels barely had time to take leave of their wives, whom they left to their own devices. They left at dawn, cheered by the people who had been liberated from the terror, to join the forces of the revolutionary general Victorio Medina, who, according to the latest reports, was on his way to Manar. Before leaving, Aureliano brought Don Apollonar Moscote out of a closet. "Rest easy, father-in-law," he told him. "The new governmental guarantees on its word of honor your personal safety and that of your family." Don Apollonar Moscote had trouble identifying that conspirator in high boots, with a rifle slung over his shoulder, with the person he had played dominoes with until 9 in the evening. "This is madness, Aurelito," he exclaimed. "Not madness," Aureliano said. "War. Don't call me Aurelito anymore. Now I'm Colonel Aureliano Buendia." So it's not Arcadio, it's Aureliano who's in charge. But yeah, that's chapter 5. Next time, chapter 6. I'm breezing right through this book. I'm going to be traveling soon. I may not take this book with me. Not only just because I won't have access, I think, to YouTube streaming. If I do have access to YouTube streaming, I may continue reading this when I'm on the move. But yeah, it's a pretty smooth read. We're already probably about a quarter of the way through the book, so 400 pages. So, all right. Thank you for watching.